Hello, everyone. I hope you will support the discussion in the comments and tell me what you would do if you found yourself in the situations I am going to talk about today. Upon inheriting my grandfather's ranch, I had no idea what to anticipate. It was 78 acres of open space, surrounded for miles by nothing but trees, fields, and sky. My grandfather had dedicated his entire life to it, and it had been in the family for many generations. It was his little piece of paradise, as he always claimed. I thought it would be mine too, a peaceful haven where I could escape it all. But I was mistaken about the quiet because that's when Karen appeared. Karen was the president of the HOA in the nearby neighborhood, so she wasn't just any neighbor. Even though the gated community was several miles away, she acted as though she was in charge of the whole region, including my property. I had no intention of joining the HOA. My ranch had never been a part of it. But Karen? She had a different viewpoint. It all started one morning when I was mending the old tractor by the barn. I heard a car approaching the driveway and turned to see a sleek, black SUV pull up. Out stepped a woman I didn't recognize, wearing sunglasses perched atop her head and carrying a clipboard under her arm. Everything about her screamed, "I'm in charge!" She was halfway up the path before I could even greet her, marching like she was about to take inventory of everything I owned. "Excuse me," she called out, brandishing her clipboard like a badge. "We need to discuss your property." I scrambled to my feet, wiping my hands on a rag. "Can I help you with something?" She gave me a tense smile, looking around as if she were surveying a battlefield. "I'm Karen, president of the HOA. We need to address a few things, starting with that fence. It doesn't comply with community standards." I stared at her, trying to absorb what she was saying. "Well, I'm not part of your HOA." Karen's smile didn't falter. "There seems to be some confusion. The HOA recently expanded its boundaries to include properties like yours. You just need to sign these documents to make it official." She held out the clipboard as if it were a mere formality, expecting me to sign on the dotted line. Instead, I gave her a disbelieving look. "Yeah, that's not going to happen," I said, taking a step back and crossing my arms. Clearly not expecting any resistance, Karen blinked. "Sir, all residents are required to follow the HOA's rules and regulations. There will be consequences if you refuse." "I'm not part of your HOA," I reiterated. "This is private property. It's been in my family for generations." At last, Karen's smile turned into a cold scowl. "You'll regret this," she snapped, before pivoting on her heel and storming back to her SUV. I thought that would be the end of it. Just a pushy woman trying to throw her weight around. But I was wrong. Over the next few weeks, she doubled down on making my life difficult. Even though my closest neighbor was over a mile away, she sent letters, left notes on my gate, and even filed noise complaints with the county. Then things escalated. One day, I came home from running errands to find a court notice taped to my front door. Karen had filed a lawsuit claiming that I was violating HOA bylaws and that my property now fell under their jurisdiction. She was suing me to enforce HOA rules and take control of my ranch. Furious but determined, I hired a local lawyer known for being a bulldog in court. He quickly identified flaws in her argument. My land wasn't legally part of the HOA. But as we dug deeper, we uncovered something even more shocking. Karen hadn't just been trying to take control of my property. She'd been embezzling money from the HOA for years. Her lawsuit against me was a last-ditch effort to cover up her illegal activities. She'd been siphoning HOA funds for personal use, and when the community's finances began to dwindle, she tried to gain more control to collect higher dues. Armed with this new information, we filed a countersuit. Not only did we get her frivolous lawsuit dismissed, but we also exposed her embezzlement to the entire community. Criminal charges were filed against Karen, and she was removed from her position as HOA president. She lost everything: her house, her reputation, and her luxurious lifestyle. The day they came to repossess her SUV was the first time in weeks that I felt like I could breathe again. I returned to my ranch and resumed my work, finally enjoying the peace and quiet I had always imagined. Karen thought she could bully me and take what wasn't hers, but in the end, it was she who learned a harsh lesson. You don't mess with someone else's property and expect to walk away unscathed. Before the next story, I would like to ask you to like this video and subscribe to my channel. Let's move on to the next story. After almost a decade of careful planning, my husband and I made the bold decision to move to our dream location, a tropical paradise. We had been saving for years, and finally, about 2 years ago, we managed to make the move. It wasn't without its challenges. Housing prices in the area were incredibly steep, comparable to places like Hawaii. With our budget, all we could afford was half of a duplex. But despite the high cost, we were thrilled with our new home. It was beautiful, located right on the water, and had space for our boat. The downside, however, was that we had to share the property with some rather unpleasant neighbors. On the other side of the duplex lived Karen, her boyfriend Billy Bob, and her 3 children. From the moment we moved in, Karen made it clear that she expected to continue using the shared backyard space as she had before. We owned the majority of the property, including 90% of the backyard, the gazebo, and 150 feet of dockage, whereas Karen's side was much smaller. She and her family had access to a modest backyard, a patio, and only about 15 feet of dock space. Despite these boundaries being outlined in their rental lease, Karen seemed to think she had the right to continue using our side as she pleased, just like the previous renters. When Karen approached me about using our backyard, I explained that while we owned the space, we were willing to be accommodating as long as she asked politely and respected our boundaries. Unfortunately, Karen misunderstood this as a blanket invitation to do whatever she wanted. One of the earliest incidents happened when my husband and I were sitting outside, enjoying a relaxing afternoon. Out of nowhere, a delivery truck arrived with equipment for a giant blow-up bouncy house, which was promptly set up in our backyard. Confused and more than a little irritated, I went over to Karen and asked what she thought she was doing. She casually informed me that it was her daughter's birthday party, as if that somehow justified taking over our backyard. To make matters worse, Karen told us that since the party was for her family and friends, we were expected to stay inside our house and keep out of the way. Her nerve was unbelievable, but not wanting to ruin a little girl's birthday party, I bit my tongue and told her that this would be the last time she would have access to our backyard. She shrugged and went about setting up the party as if nothing had happened. As the party went on, things escalated. At one point, a random drunk guest wandered into our house, which completely caught us off guard. When I asked what he was doing, he said that Karen told him she owned the whole property and that he could use whichever bathroom was available. I was stunned by her audacity. Politely, but firmly, I redirected him to Karen's side of the duplex. Not long after, Karen came storming into our home, yelling about how we had embarrassed her in front of her friends and how we were being selfish for not allowing them to use our bathroom. Her reasoning? She thought we didn't deserve all the space we had just because it was only the two of us living there. Furious, I demanded that she leave or I'd be calling the cops. Thankfully, she eventually left, and the party wound down soon after. After that fiasco, my husband and I decided that enough was enough. We needed to establish clear boundaries to prevent any further overstepping. We hired a contractor to build a fence that would divide the property, giving Karen no access to our side. While we were at it, we figured we might as well make some upgrades to the patio, add an outdoor kitchen, and install a fire pit. The plan was to turn our backyard into the private oasis we had always wanted. When the construction crew arrived, Karen, being her nosy self, immediately came over to investigate. I kept my explanation vague, only mentioning that we were updating the patio. Of course, I could see the wheels turning in her head as she imagined that somehow this new setup would also be hers to use. However, when the workers began putting up the fence, Karen lost it. She came outside, screaming at them to stop working immediately. I calmly walked over, told the workers to continue, and advised Karen to mind her own business. As expected, she didn't take it well and proceeded to call the cops. What happened next was almost too satisfying. When the police arrived, I explained that we were simply building a fence on our property, something that the landlord was fully aware of. Karen, who wasn't even the landlord, was quickly put in her place. Watching her get a stern lecture from the officer was priceless. She stormed back into her house, slamming the sliding door so hard that I thought it might break. With the fence finally up, we hoped that would be the end of the drama. Unfortunately, Karen wasn't done causing problems. Not long after, Karen's boyfriend, Billy Bob, started making his presence known. He was as much of a nuisance as Karen, if not worse. He would throw cigarette butts and empty beer cans over our fence as some kind of revenge for disrespecting his woman. I hadn't expected to deal with such behavior in what was supposed to be paradise, but Billy Bob was the walking stereotype of trailer trash. Then came the boat incident. Billy Bob owned a 30-foot fishing boat, far too large to fit in their 15 feet of dock space. At the time, we were renting out some of our dockage to help cover costs. One of our renters had tied up their boat along the property line, but Billy Bob decided he wanted that spot for himself. While we were out of town, Billy Bob and Karen pretended to be us and told the renters they needed to vacate the dock at the end of the month. Unaware of what was happening, the renters complied, and Billy Bob parked his boat where theirs had been. Weeks later, I discovered the deception when the renter left a nasty review, accusing us of being rude and going back on an agreement to let them stay longer. That's when I realized what had happened. I was livid when I pieced it all together. Karen and Billy Bob had not only lied to our renters but also cost us income by driving them away. I immediately called the police to report the situation. When the cops arrived, Karen and Billy Bob tried to argue that the boat was fully on their property, which was a blatant lie. When that failed, they pivoted to claiming that no one could own the water. While technically true, the seawall and dockage rights were clearly ours, as outlined in our deed. Karen and Billy Bob continued shouting, calling us liars, and it all came to a head when Billy Bob, in his drunken rage, decided to punch one of the officers. That, of course, landed Billy Bob in jail. While I felt bad for the officers having to deal with his outburst, I couldn't help but feel a little vindicated. The police gave Karen and Billy Bob a strict warning. Move the boat or it would be towed away, which in boating terms meant they'd haul it out of the water and impound it. In the meantime, I won a small claims lawsuit against them for the lost rental income, though I never saw a penny of it. Billy Bob was still locked up when Karen had to scramble to move the boat, and I managed to convince the previous renters to return by offering them a few months of free dockage as compensation for the hassle. I thought things might quiet down after that, but naturally, Karen wasn't done being a thorn in our side. The situation came to a head when the property owner, an older gentleman who lived far away and was tired of dealing with Karen's constant complaints, decided he wanted out. The housing market was struggling and he needed cash. That's when the perfect opportunity presented itself to us. The landlord approached us with an offer to buy the other half of the duplex, the side that Karen and Billy Bob were renting. He knew Karen was a nightmare tenant, but he sweetened the deal by offering the property at a reduced price with the stipulation that we let Karen finish out her lease, which was up in a few months. We didn't hesitate. With some savings we had been looking to reinvest, we jumped at the chance to not only control the entire duplex but also finally rid ourselves of Karen. Within 2 weeks, the deal closed, and we became the owners of both sides of the property. Karen had no idea that we were now her landlords. We registered the property under an LLC to keep things quiet, and for a while, we let her live in blissful ignorance. But that changed about a week later. I decided it was time to break the news. I walked over to Karen's door, smiling to myself as I knocked. When she opened it, her usual sour expression greeted me. "What the hell do you want?" she snapped. With a sweet smile, I handed her the updated landlord information. "Rent's due Friday, Karen. If it's easier, you can just hand me the check directly." The color drained from her face. I had always heard people talk about watching someone's face go pale with shock, but this was the first time I'd seen it in real life. Karen was speechless, standing there with the paper in her hand, unable to comprehend that we now owned her half of the duplex. I kept my tone polite but firm, as I reminded her that we were honoring her lease until the end of July. But she should start making plans to move because we intended to remodel the place before the next tenants moved in. It was a moment of pure satisfaction. After all the headaches, the disrespect, and the constant boundary pushing, we finally had the upper hand. But of course, Karen didn't leave quietly. In the months leading up to the end of her lease, Karen's antics continued. There were near-weekly parties, and her kids were constantly causing trouble, throwing lit fireworks at our boat on more than one occasion. We had to call the police several times to break up their raucous gatherings. And yet, despite all the chaos, Karen kept paying rent on time, and we were bound by the terms of her lease. As July approached, we sent Karen an official 30-day notice that we would not be renewing her lease and offered to prorate the rent for July if she moved out early. We also waived the termination fee to make it easier for her to leave, but she didn't take the offer. Instead, she dug in her heels and stayed put. By the time the lease expired, she still hadn't made any move to leave. Worse yet, the COVID eviction moratorium had been put into place, meaning we couldn't legally force her out. Billy Bob, meanwhile, had been released from jail, but things between him and Karen were clearly strained. One night, after another loud argument, Billy Bob left the house in a fury. I learned later that the fight ended with him getting arrested again. This time, though, he didn't come back. Still, Karen remained as stubborn as ever, staying in the duplex rent-free, taking full advantage of the eviction freeze. It felt like there was no end in sight to this ordeal. We even had plans to move my husband's elderly parents into the other half of the duplex, as they needed more care and couldn't continue living on their own. But they didn't want to live with us. They wanted their own space, which meant we needed to get Karen out. Yet, with the legal protections in place, there was nothing we could do. It wasn't until the fall of that year that things took an unexpected turn. In October, Karen's mother, Susan, moved in with her. Apparently, Susan's landlord had chosen not to renew her lease, and with nowhere else to go, she landed on Karen's doorstep. At first, I braced myself for the situation to get even worse. After all, Karen's children were already wild, and with another adult in the house, I expected things to spiral out of control. But to my surprise, Susan was nothing like her daughter. From the moment she arrived, Susan made it clear that she wouldn't tolerate Karen's behavior. I first noticed the change when I heard Susan yelling at Karen about the state of the house. Within days, the place looked cleaner, quieter, and, dare I say it, almost peaceful. Karen, for once, seemed like the one being put in her place, sulking around like a scolded teenager. I wasn't the only one who noticed. The kids, who had previously been little terrors, were suddenly much better behaved. I no longer had to deal with random fireworks being thrown at our boat or trash being tossed over the fence. Susan had whipped everyone into shape, and honestly, it felt like a small miracle. Curious, I decided to see if this new dynamic would last. So I went over one afternoon to introduce myself to Susan properly. What I didn't expect was how quickly we hit it off. Susan turned out to be a delightful woman. She was mortified when she learned about all the trouble Karen and her kids had caused us. We bonded quickly, and soon we were sharing drinks in the backyard every few days, chatting about life, and eventually, even baking together on the weekends. Susan had a love for baking, something I hadn't done in years, and she would bring over recipes from her mother's old cookbook. Every weekend, we would set up in my newly renovated outdoor kitchen, whipping up batches of cookies, pies, and cakes, and exchanging stories while we worked. The holidays rolled around, and with COVID making travel difficult, neither of our families was able to come visit. Since Susan and I had grown close, we decided to have a small Thanksgiving feast together in the backyard, with a few games set up for entertainment. Karen and the kids even participated, and for the first time, the whole situation felt almost normal. Karen, who was usually a ball of anger and bitterness, was surprisingly pleasant during the gathering. I couldn't believe it, but I wasn't about to complain. By Christmas, the same routine followed. We made a big meal, played backyard games, and even exchanged small gifts. The whole experience was surreal considering how hostile things had been just a few months prior. Susan seemed to have worked wonders on Karen, who, though still far from perfect, was at least tolerable. As the months passed, I began to realize that I didn't even mind that they were still living in the duplex. Susan was so easy to get along with that it made the situation bearable. One afternoon, over a glass of wine, I told Susan she didn't need to worry about rent until they found another place. I knew Karen hadn't been paying, but genuinely didn't mind as long as things remained peaceful. But Susan, being the responsible and kind woman she was, refused to let us go without compensation. She insisted on paying, so I lied about the amount and only charged her enough to cover taxes and insurance. It was a fraction of the actual rent, but she insisted on drawing up a new lease, making the arrangement official, even if it was just month to month. Despite the oddly pleasant living situation, Susan made it clear that she didn't plan to stay forever. She wanted to move back to her home state eventually, and Karen, much to my surprise, seemed open to the idea of going with her. I think even Karen had started to realize she needed a change. She had been more subdued ever since Billy Bob's dramatic exit, and I couldn't help but feel like maybe she was ready to leave the chaos behind. Of course, COVID was still throwing wrenches into everyone's plans, so their timeline for moving out wasn't set in stone. In the meantime, I was more than content to let things stay as they were. Having Susan around was a blessing, and for the first time since we moved in, the duplex actually felt like a peaceful place to live. Still, life had a way of keeping us on our toes. As much as things had improved, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was only a matter of time before Karen reverted to her old ways. My husband and I remained cautious, knowing that while the current situation was bearable, we had to be prepared for anything. With Susan's influence, Karen was a changed woman for now, but who knew how long that would last? As the months rolled on, things between Susan and Karen seemed stable, but my husband and I remained wary. We didn't want to get too comfortable, knowing Karen's history. Still, it was hard not to appreciate the newfound peace Susan had brought into our lives. Every weekend, we continued to bake, share drinks, and even spend time with her grandchildren who had mellowed out significantly under her watchful eye. Karen, though still prickly, kept to herself for the most part. She no longer threw loud parties or let her kids run wild through the neighborhood. For a while, it seemed like we'd found an unexpected harmony. However, there were moments where Karen's old self peeked through. One particular day, as I was out watering the garden, Karen came over, her arms crossed and her familiar scowl back on her face. "You know, you didn't have to let my mother move in," she started, her voice dripping with that same entitlement I remembered from the early days. "We would have been fine without your charity." I put down the hose and looked at her, trying to keep my tone calm. "Karen, your mom's been nothing but wonderful since she arrived. I'm glad she's here." Karen huffed and kicked a pebble at the edge of the sidewalk. "Yeah, well, don't think we're staying forever. Once this pandemic stuff is over, we're out of here." I shrugged, not wanting to escalate things. "You're welcome to stay as long as you need to, but we've already discussed the terms with your mom. She knows we're remodeling once you move out." Her eyes narrowed. "Remodeling? What are you going to do? Tear down everything I've lived with for 8 years?" I gave her a tight smile. "The place could use some upgrades, Karen. It's time for a change." She didn't reply, just turned on her heel and marched back inside. That little exchange left me uneasy. Though things were still peaceful, Karen's attitude reminded me that we couldn't count on her cooperation forever. My husband and I had already made plans to begin remodeling once Karen and Susan moved out, and I couldn't help but wonder if Karen's stubbornness would become a problem when that time came. Sure enough, things started to shift after that conversation. Karen's moods became more unpredictable. She was still mostly kept in check by Susan, but the tension was building. Susan and I continued our weekend baking sessions, But Karen began distancing herself again, staying indoors or glaring at us from a distance. I could feel the shift in the air. It was like Karen was preparing for a final confrontation, as if the realization that her time in the duplex was running out was starting to sink in. It wasn't until late spring that the real trouble started. With COVID restrictions easing, Susan had begun looking more seriously at places to move. She'd found a few options back in her home state and was getting ready to put a plan together. But Karen, predictably, was dragging her feet. Every time Susan brought up moving, Karen would find an excuse to stall or argue about the logistics. It was clear that Karen wasn't ready to leave, despite everything. One night, things came to a head. My husband and I were in bed when we heard shouting coming from the other side of the duplex. It wasn't the usual muffled sounds of a disagreement either. This was full-blown yelling. Karen and Susan were going at it, their voices carrying through the thin walls. "You're not even trying to find another place," Susan shouted. "I'm not going to stay here forever just because you can't let go." "I don't want to move, Mom," Karen screamed back. "This is my home, and I'm not going anywhere. You can't make me leave." My husband and I exchanged worried glances, not sure what to do. We didn't want to intervene, but the shouting continued, and soon there was the sound of something breaking, followed by a door slamming. After a few minutes, everything went silent. The next morning, I found Susan sitting outside by the gazebo, looking exhausted. I walked over to her with 2 cups of coffee and handed her one. "Rough night?" I asked gently. She sighed, taking a sip. "You could say that. Karen's, well, you heard it. She's refusing to leave. Every time I bring it up, it turns into a fight." "I'm sorry," I said, not sure what else to say. "Is there anything I can do?" Susan shook her head. "No, I'll figure it out. I know she's scared, but I can't stay here forever. I need to go home." I nodded, but deep down, I was worried. If Karen was this resistant to leaving, what would happen when her time was finally up? The eviction moratorium was set to expire soon, and once it did, we'd have the legal ability to remove them from the property. I didn't want it to come to that, but Karen wasn't giving us many other options. As the summer dragged on, things remained tense. Susan kept trying to make plans to move, but Karen resisted every step of the way. Then, in late July, the eviction moratorium officially ended. We knew that we couldn't delay the inevitable any longer. My husband and I had already planned the remodeling work, and with Karen's refusal to leave voluntarily, we had no choice but to move forward with the eviction process. I dreaded the confrontation, but there was no other way. It was time to reclaim our property. The day we finally moved forward with the eviction was one of the most stressful I can remember. Susan had done everything in her power to calm Karen down, but it was clear Karen wasn't going to accept the situation quietly. My husband and I had tried to be as accommodating as possible, giving her every chance to leave on her own terms. But now it was out of our hands. We had our lawyer handle the paperwork, and a date was set for the eviction. When that day came, I stood in the backyard trying to keep myself calm. I could hear Karen's muffled voice inside the house, getting louder by the second. It wasn't hard to imagine her pacing back and forth, spewing frustration at whoever would listen, probably Susan, who had become more of a referee than a mother at this point. The police arrived in the early afternoon, as scheduled. We had warned them ahead of time that Karen might not take things well, but I could see the officers bracing themselves as they knocked on the door. I stayed out of sight, letting them handle it, but the tension was palpable. When Karen opened the door, I could hear the shouting start almost immediately. She was furious, her voice filled with indignation and rage as she demanded to know why she was being forced out of her own home. The officers explained the situation calmly, pointing out that the eviction was legal and that she had been given ample time to find a new place. But Karen, being Karen, wasn't having it. "I'm not going anywhere," she screamed. "This is my home, and you can't just throw me out like some piece of trash." I could hear one of the officers trying to reason with her, but it was clear Karen wasn't in the mood to listen. Susan tried to intervene, speaking in a low, soothing tone, but Karen's anger was a force of its own. At one point, I heard a loud crash. Karen had knocked something over in her fit of rage. That's when I knew it was about to get even uglier. Within moments, the shouting escalated further. Karen began hurling insults at the officers, accusing them of being corrupt, of siding with us, of being part of some grand conspiracy to ruin her life. The police, to their credit, remained calm, but they were firm in their approach. They had a job to do, and they weren't leaving until it was done. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I heard one of the officers say, "Ma'am, if you don't leave voluntarily, we will have no choice but to remove you ourselves." That was the breaking point. Karen let out a guttural scream, slamming the door and retreating back inside the house. For a moment, there was silence, and I thought maybe she was packing up her things, accepting that it was over. But then, in a move that shocked us all, Karen reappeared, marching right past the officers and stomped into my backyard. I watched in disbelief as she stormed toward me, her face flushed with anger. "This is all your fault," she yelled, pointing a shaking finger at me. "You think you can just buy this place and kick me out? You think you're better than me?" I opened my mouth to respond, but before I could, Susan appeared behind her, looking defeated. "Karen, enough, it's over. We have to go." Karen spun around, her eyes wild. I'm not going anywhere, Mom. I'm not leaving my home. Susan's voice was soft, but firm. This isn't your home anymore, Karen. It's time to go. There was a long pause as Karen processed her mother's words. Her face crumpled, and for the first time since this entire saga had begun, I saw genuine defeat in her eyes. She looked like a child who had just lost everything. It was almost heartbreaking to see, but then, just as quickly as her demeanor shifted, the rage returned. She spun back toward me, glaring. "You'll regret this," she hissed, before turning and storming off toward the house. The police followed her, giving her space but making it clear they weren't leaving without her. A few hours later, the house was empty. Karen had packed what she could, and the rest was left behind in a haphazard mess. Susan, true to her word, had helped move things along, but it was clear she was exhausted by the ordeal. As the sun began to set, Susan came over to me one last time. "I'm so sorry for everything," she said quietly, her voice heavy with emotion. She's not well. I should have stepped in sooner." I shook my head, feeling a strange mix of relief and sympathy. "You did what you could, Susan. I'm just sorry it had to end this way." We stood there for a moment in silence, the weight of everything that had happened hanging in the air. Finally, Susan gave me a tired smile. "Thank you for being patient with us. I hope things get better from here." I nodded, watching as Susan walked back to her car and drove away. It felt surreal. After everything we'd been through, Karen was finally gone. The weight of her presence had been lifted, and for the first time in months, I felt like we could breathe again. Over the next few weeks, my husband and I set to work on remodeling the duplex. The space that had once been the source of so much stress was now becoming something beautiful, something we could finally enjoy. My husband's parents moved into the newly renovated space, and it was a relief to have them close by, especially since they needed the care. Life slowly began to return to normal, and the drama that had once consumed us became a distant memory. As for Karen, I heard through the grapevine that she moved back in with Susan in their home state. I don't know if she ever found peace, but I hope that, in some way, this experience had taught her something. In the end, it wasn't the tropical paradise we had envisioned when we first moved in, but it became a place where we could finally find peace. And for that, I was grateful. Thank you for watching.